We're back live, people. Talkin Thrones, episode 15, season 2. Pat, we're somehow already halfway through season 2. We're just banging through these episodes like crazy. I mean, I guess that just goes to show how fast the story went back in the day. Entitled The Ghost of Harrenhal. Pat, I'm interested to see what your joke for the beginning of this episode is going to be.
I wonder if the Talking TV audience is as surprised as I am that there was no pottery scene in this episode. So 90s reference there if you get it, but hey, let's just enjoy this episode.
Indeed. All of that and more. Stay tuned. Well, Pat, we're here at the halfway point of season 2 somehow. It's crazy because I feel like last season it took us forever to get to this point, and this season it feels like, wow, where did the time go? It feels like there's so much that happened in the first 4 episodes of this show. Now we're on episode 5, and we know that the next 5 episodes are obviously still so jam-packed as far as things to come. Just like, what's your take on that, just first and foremost?
I don't know. We didn't see any Kurt Russell or Demi Moore, I believe it is, in Harrenhal, right?
Oh man, I didn't realize I was about to say I didn't realize we were going with that reference.
Oh, you didn't pick up on it? Well,
no, I didn't.
Hey, listen, it's a great 90s movie called Ghost, and the Ghost of Harrenhal. So
wait, Kurt Russell? You mean Patrick Swayze?
Oh, it's Swayze. Yeah,
that's why I didn't pick up. God damn it!
All right, so Swayze makes a little more sense, but
yeah, that makes a lot more sense. But oh man, if only Kurt Russell in that role. Wow, you just spawned up, I think, an entirely different what if universe of what could have happened there.
It would have been a little more action packed. I'm pretty sure.
I think so. It probably would have been a little bit more machine guns. John Carpenter probably would have directed it. It probably would have had a lot of like really weird cornball scene. I can only imagine what the Hellfire scene, and the Hellfire scenes in that movie were already like absolutely crazy indeed. How do we get onto this tangent? All right.
I'm sorry. It's just about the ghosts. I'm beating the dead horse with the ghosts.
The title is in reference to kind of the nickname that the soldiers of Harrenhal kind of extend unintentionally onto Arya, which is the silent killer, obviously, that seems to be killing all of the soldiers there, referred to collectively as the Ghost of Harrenhal. Harrenhal, the castle, obviously has its own little lore behind it. Obviously, famously constructed by Harren the Black as this impenetrable fortress, of course. And in theory, yes, no army could march on it from the land at all. But of course, this was destroyed when the Targaryens obviously came, and Aegon the Conqueror, riding Balerion the Black Dread, roasted the castle to the ground, leaving it as a smoldering ruin. And then for some reason, it still has like some of the highest value in the entire land of Westeros. I'm really not sure why that is, but famously the castle has changed hands several times. It was in it was first in the control of Janos Slynt, then it was promptly passed to Peter Baelish, even though the actual people who took up residence there were Tywin Lannister throughout the course of this season, and then Roose Bolton over the course of next season. It has since been deserted. Again, I really don't see the point kind of why this castle is still so famed as far as it's kind of, outside of the ghost story surrounding it. But like, I guess that makes sense considering the fact that this is a major turning point, not only for the show in general, but really just for the story itself, because this is where everything really starts to coalesce, right? Not just with the main storyline happening in King's Landing and Storm's End and with everything else, but like all the secondary storylines are finally starting to reach their breaking point. Daenerys and Jon, who pretty much coasted on the sidelines, are finally starting to like take a part in their action. Bran, we're finally, after like a season and a half of not seeing him really do anything, we're finally starting to see a little bit happening in his corner of the world. So like, there's quite a lot that happens in this episode. So without further ado, you ready to dive in, Pat?
Yeah, I don't know what you want to talk about first. Like, I think we're already on the Harrenhal storyline, so we might as well.
So the reason why I kicked that off is kind of just so I could do the gotcha first segment and at the beginning, because like we have a lot to talk about in this episode, but also just because I feel like kind of it creates this like looming dread that kind of looms over this entire episode. As you mentioned before this started, there's a lot of setup in this episode for a lot of the explosive events that are going to come later on in this season. Obviously, like we said, Stannis and Theon are both making their plans of attack. Tyrion, after hearing news of what happens at the beginning of this episode, is preparing to defend King's Landing. But we should start with the opening scene, obviously, Episode 15, the Ghost.
So you just want to talk about the shadow?
Well, yeah, because that's what kicks off the
Right.
whole episode. Because, well, I mean, first off, just the, I think, interesting decision to have Renly's death not be the end of the last episode, but have it be the event that kicks off the beginning of this episode, right? We're so used to deaths in TV being the major cap-offs to episode that it almost happening in the beginning comes as quite a shock. But you obviously have a controversial take on the Shadow Assassin just in general, so why don't you take it from here?
Well, Dom, I think the shadow sort of just comes about, it's like Melisandre is sort of just giving birth and the shadow thing happens. And then immediately the next episode, it kills Renly and then we never see the shadow again. Yes, it has the face of Stannis. Yes, Brienne is obsessed with this and it kind of has a complete arc for her in the whole entire series. But for the most part, the blood magic here is just sort of used to kill Renly, wash him off the story plot, and then never explained ever.
Wash him off the storyboard.
Yeah, so I'm personally just think it's not overly. There's not too much of an investment there with the Shadow baby. It's just like face of Stannis. Brienne wants revenge. All right, let's get rid of the Shadow, never to be seen ever again or talked about ever again. It's is Brienne really charged with killing Stannis? Does that moment later on in season 5, I believe, does that really come to fruition? It's sort of just put on the back burner, and like there was a shadow in this show, remember, 3 seasons ago? So I feel like it's one of those arcs that is necessary. It makes sense, but at the same time, they don't invest too much into it.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where, again, in an attempt to sort of get into more of the magical elements, Martin with the book and also later Benioff and Weiss with the show kind of fall into that trap of, just kind of relying on magic for plot point's sake. As far as, Renly, you can clearly tell was never a character that was supposed to be more than a plot device, right? Renly set up as being this great king, possibly, who could kind of succeed Robert in every single way, even though he's not actually in line for the throne, but unfortunately his Baratheon stubbornness refuses to allow him to see the bigger picture, and of course he defies Stannis at every turn, so of course Stannis does what he does, and now unfortunately Renly has paid the price for it in blood magic. R.I.P. Renly, the first major death to kick off this episode. Of course, Renly's soldiers come in seconds later, and of course the shadow has mysteriously vanished, and they're like, oh, well, there can't be anything suspicious about what's going on here. So obviously, they attack Brienne. Brienne kills both the soldiers. Her and Cat have to go on the run. Later on, you kind of see the ripple effects in the camp. Littlefinger obviously starting to work his his little meddling tactics.
Well,
right?
I think this was really good of the show because Baelish comes in and he sees Loras, who's sort of pining over Renly's death, and Marjorie is sort of, hey, we got, this is dangerous. This is bad for our plans. And essentially, Baelish talks to Marjorie and she says, I want to be the queen. And you get that sense that Baelish is now going to broker that deal between the Tyrells and the Lannisters. Like, obviously, if you haven't seen the show up to this point, you're not going to pick up on that. But if you've seen the show a couple times, like, it's quite clear that the payoff at the end of this season, when the Tyrells sort of team up with the Lannisters, this is like a on-screen seed that's planted that's really going to happen because Marjorie wants to be, quote unquote, the queen.
And I think another detail in particular that works really, really well about this scene, this is probably the sequence, this is probably one of my favorite scenes in this whole episode, because again, just showing the genius of Littlefinger, of what he is as a tactician and a negotiator, why he is such a dangerous foe and such a helpful ally to have. Like, right, Martin critiqued on this fact that he actually thought this was one of the things that Benioff and Weiss got wrong about the show, was their adaptation and translation of Littlefinger from the books of the show, because there's a line at some point where somebody says, I don't remember what season or character, but somebody says nobody likes Littlefinger. We all just have him because we can use him. And Martin said that that's not at all what he wanted the translation of Littlefinger to be. He said the whole reason why Littlefinger was such a threat is because nobody saw his betrayal coming. Everybody trusted him. Like the whole kind of thing that makes it so surprising in King's Landing is the fact that, Littlefinger did seem like such a trustworthy person up until that point. But you see in this scene kind of, how he works, kind of plays to each person's strength and weakness in order to appeal to them, right? First, obviously, with Loras, where I think the interesting thing about Loras as he's pining over Renly's body is the fact that he, very similar to Brienne later on when she admits no, since they both obviously had this very strong admiration for Renly, they know that Stannis is behind this. They can't prove it, obviously, but they know just in their heart of hearts that Stannis is responsible for this. It's all too convenient for him, and how that wraps up. So obviously Littlefinger plays to that, right? What's it called? Loras' strong need for revenge. He's just like, okay, so now you're desperate against Stannis, and now what's it called? What's your best bet of getting that? Robb Stark is not going to be able to help you. He's too far away dealing with Tywin Lannister. And then, of course, he appeals to Marjorie, who he knows is the real power. And Marjorie kind of admits, he's like, yeah, if Renly wasn't a king, then I could never have been a queen. And she kind of understands real that this whole kind of squabbling for power, everyone kind of, grabbing a crown, trying to grab a piece of the pie. And she realizes it's like, yeah, there's only one defining power right now, and it's whoever sits on this Iron Throne. It's kind of a reconsideration for her, and I feel like it's kind of a reconsideration for this entire show. Just kind of everyone coming to terms with the fact that, yeah, when it comes to power, there can be only one, But ultimately, we see how this plays out in the next sequence, obviously later on in the Stormlands, when obviously it's a quick sequence, obviously, with Stannis and Davos in this episode, but they're kind of surveying later on. The Tyrells have deserted. They're overseeing, the massive amount of forces that they've just gained. Davos is obviously trying to question Stannis. He's like, Stannis, you know what you did here, man. Like, this is not just some like quick kind of small thing that you just sweep under the rug here. You enacted blood magic in order to murder your brother in order to gain a foothold. And Stannis gives an excuse that Tywin Lannister later gives to Tyrion. You see this kind of thread start to pop up a lot throughout the show, where he's like, in one swift move, I gained all of these men and this massive advantage with only the loss of one life. It's kind of this interesting point that he brings up. Obviously, when you have leaders that have to make tough decisions like this in battle, the cost of only a few people through an absolutely dastardly means, as opposed to engaging in quote unquote honorable warfare, resulting in massive loss of life.
Well, this is the tragedy of Stannis, is that every time that he implores this magic, he loses something big. So this time, his brother, right? He sacrifices him, and he gains all these men. But, it's sort of like the, what is it? The monkey's paw, the three wishes, be careful what you wish for type of scenario, where he, yes, kills his brother, gains all these men, but then Blackwater, he's outsmarted and basically defeated. And was there any point to this magic? In the end, that we'll see in this season, there wasn't. And he keeps going at it. He keeps using these magic tactics, and they only get him so far, and then it sort of backfires on him. So Stannis, the tragedy of him is that he never gets to realize how bad this magic actually is for him. He gets this like short-term advantage, and it looks great. Things are going his way, but then he's goes two steps backwards. And so it's interesting to sort of watch the series again and just see Stannis unfold and just put his blinders on, like, this is the way to go, this is the way to go. But he just never really picks up on the fact that this magic is really, one step forward, two steps back.
Yeah.
And it's really not working for him. And even though he has the strongest claim for the throne, it just keeps getting in his way.
Yeah, Stannis is ultimately, again, like all the Baratheons, it seems, and really every character in Game of Thrones, Stannis is his own worst enemy. Every single time he thinks that he's got an advantage, something comes up and kind of outsmarts him, right? Obviously, and in a way, also, that's also set up in this episode when he ends up taking Davos' advice to not bring Melisandre with him on the battle when they storm King's Landing. But as a result of kind of, trying to, craft a dig at Davos, and, for questioning him, he makes Davos in charge of the fleet, in order to, and basically makes him on like the lead ship in order to attack King's Landing. Like, he's fully in his own head. He's fully confident that he's got the entire advantage, and he doesn't at all seek to consider just everything that's going on, really. He completely thinks that, his foes are completely powerless. And that brings us, I think, really nicely into the King's Landing story arc of this episode, which is minimal. Oh, yeah. But important.
I would say, like, Davos and Stannis are talking about the Blackwater and how that's going to be the assault. And we also get this great scene from Tyrion where he's talking with, I guess, one of the Holy Orders or some kind of order.
Yeah, what's it called? Oh my God, I can't remember the name of it, but it's the Pyromaster, Halfling or something like that.
And so, wildfire, was crafted for the Targaryens after the dragons died, I guess. And basically Cersei kind of picked up on this and has had them manufacture day and night wildfire. And now Tyrion's like, you don't manufacture it for Cersei anymore. You manufacture it for me. Like real mobster style, he takes over and just like, hey, we're going to have so much wildfire. We don't know what to do with
Yeah,
it.
and because the whole thing there comes from the fact that like he sees that like, okay, this wildfire is our key to defeating Stannis. Like the whole thing that he's kind of been sweating about, and you see this obviously in the setup in the storyline when he's discussing things with Cersei, where he's talking with Cersei. He's like, understand now, Cersei's kind of happy that Renly's off the board, but Tyrion reminds her, like, yeah, just because Renly's out of the picture does not mean that we should have any means to relax or celebrate. Stannis now has all the forces that he needs to come at us, and he is coming. But of course, Cersei will not work with him at all. She still thinks that he's his enemy.
Yeah.
He is
so Tyrion has to go the only place he can, and that's
right.
Lancel Lannister.
Poor Lancel. He's another one of those characters that it feels like the author just wrote because they needed a character to get picked on. And we know that these types of people exist in real life, but like it somehow just makes it even funnier every time Tyrion kind of just uses him to his advantage. And I love the scene where, like, first of all, they're in this tiny cart that Lancel can barely fit in, just sitting in the side of the street. No, there's no like fancy character or anything like that. You wouldn't even know anything about there since Bran is just starting it.
That was pretty good production design, I think, to shrink it down for Tyrion's sake. It's kind of a visual joke. It plays on the fact that everyone considers Tyrion the imp and he's short and whatnot, and so. I don't know how you would think about it. Like, is Tyrion sort of playing into that and going with it? It seems quite odd, but he definitely he must have been aware that this card is very small, right. And maybe he did it for Lancel's discomfort.
Maybe. All I know is that he uses it to intimidate Lancel to his great effect. And it's funny because he doesn't believe Lancel at first, obviously, but Lancel kind of has to repeat himself a couple times. And then, obviously, once they find the catch, Bran completely doubts that the wildfire is even real. But upon seeing all the massive amounts of cards, Tyrion realizes that he's real. Again, the problem that he has is not necessarily with Joffrey and Cersei's plan, but how they intend to execute it. Because their plan is they're planning on hoisting it from catapults all the way into and burn Stannis' fleet. But Tyrion understands that it's like, okay, this much wildfire, if the rumors are true about this, could lay waste to King's Landing, as we later see to great effect in both in the season 6 and the season 8 finales, final couple of episodes. This stuff is destructive and dangerous. So he instead, as we later see executed in the Battle of Blackwater, comes up with a plan to only use a minimal amount at a great distance of the city in order to destroy a majority of the fleet, as we see. So again, it is set up, but it is important. But there's one other instance that I think
it's a great plot introduction for the entire series because it gets brought back so many times, as you just brought up. It's very good that the wildfire is such a destructive weapon because when the plot points, that those shoes drop and we get to see it in action, it really is, pun intended, explosive.
Right. And the other thing, too, obviously, that comes about in this episode is the beginning of kind of the long-term game that would set up the next 2 seasons of Tyrion's arc. I think would just set up brilliantly in this episode is kind of the dissidence that comes from the residents of King's Landing towards Tyrion, ultimately, where they believe that Tyrion's inclusion into the city has created this massive disruptive effect where he is.
What was he called? He was called
the tune of a twisted demon monkey. And then Tyrion's like, you do have to admire the man's the man. What did he say? The man's descriptions. And he's like, they're talking. And Bran's like, they're talking about you. And he's like, what? Demon monkey after I'm trying to save them. And Bran, I think, again, it's like the whole thing is they're not in on the comings and goings of King's Landing. So, of course, the only thing they see is that Tyrion was the new person in town. And ever since he came in, obviously, things have been kind of very disruptive and destructive overall with everything going on. Clearly, that's not true, obviously. But from the low-born commoner's perspective, it's like, they're starving in the streets.
It all goes back to Joffrey and, him misinterpreting what fear is, right? Joffrey's like, off with his head, kill these bastard children, just whatever, disgusting thing he can think of, people will fear me because of that. And that's not true fear. That's just something to really hate and really despise. Whereas Tywin, we already saw when he arrived at Harrenhal, the way that he sort of, instructed fear. Like, think about it, like Tywin comes in, his men are like killing and torturing these people. He comes in, he's like, well, why don't you put them to work? And essentially he comes in sort of as a savior, but he probably had his men torture enough people to put the fear into them, but he displaced it onto some of his men as like, oh, he wasn't there to stop it. So he sort of pulls these strings and knows how to make the Lannisters fearful without really putting that anger on him. Whereas Joffrey, his biggest mistake right now is he's just, putting all this hate out there and getting the people against him. And that's turning against every Lannister that is in King's Landing.
And of course, poor Tyrion has to take the brunt of it, and we later see that happen, not only throughout the course of season 3, but we see it obviously come to fruition in season 4, obviously, when everything kind of comes to a giant collapse for Tyrion. But one more point that I want to do before we get into all the secondary plots that set up this episode, which is obviously the last scene with Catelyn and Brienne, where they kind of, they're recovering and recouping after escaping from Renly's forces. Bran obviously states that she saw the shadow, and that, and that she must take revenge on Stannis for it. Kat says that she can't. Kat says that there's nothing that she could have done for Renly, obviously, and that she shouldn't have wasted her life by killing it. And then she attempts to try and recruit her for Robb. But instead, Brienne declares her loyalty for Catelyn, which obviously later sets up the famous, in a way. Again, a lot of setup that happens in this episode, setting up for, her inevitable journey with Jaime when Catelyn ultimately makes the decision that has been instilled in her head by Littlefinger to send Jaime south to King's Landing in exchange for the girls. But I think it's an interesting scene here where Brienne declares loyalty not to Robb because she doesn't know him, but because she believes that Catelyn has a strong sense of fortitude in her that, that kind of separates her from, a lot of the traditional males that she served. She's not a warrior perchance, but she has this very strong sense of self and duty to her son, to her family, that Brienne respects, obviously. And so, although the relationship between those two is brief, I think that it's definitely worth noting as far as that goes, especially since, obviously, Kat's inevitable death is a driving factor towards Brienne for the rest of the show, ultimately.
Yeah, I think Brienne basically takes this oath because she has nowhere else to go, and it's Catelyn was really smart in how she handled herself in Renly's camp. And so there's a little bit of respect, and, it's like, I have nowhere to go. I can't go back to Renly's camp. I can't be with Stannis because, that's, they're just, they want me for murder, and also I want to kill Stannis, so that's not going to be good. So Brienne has nowhere to go, so she swears an oath to someone that, she respects, even if it's like sort of a short earned respect. But this is going to define her character for pretty much, the next few seasons. And it's one of those things where I think Brienne, as part of her storyline, she has to hold on to this oath because she deep down realizes that there's nothing else. And so she's kind of, this takes this oath almost out of desperation, and, but at the same time, making sure that Catelyn's wishes, that her daughters are safe, is a noble cause. And, that's what allows her to sort of be knightly throughout the next couple seasons. Yeah,
ultimately, Brienne is a character that is defined by her oaths, ultimately, right? Her oath to Catelyn, her oath later on to Jaime to find Sansa, her oath to Sansa in order to continue on, obviously, with Kat's protection, and kind of, she is ultimately a character that is defined by honor. And I think that her rigid sense of self-duty to it is a large portion of how some sort of honor is later instilled, obviously, in later on in the show. You see kind of that as a ripple effect that goes out and that affects other characters. Obviously, we see how this affects Jaime and his big transition later on. How it ultimately ends up, affecting Sansa as well and her decision making. And unfortunately, I think that it kind of becomes a little bit faulty, obviously, because her and Jaime develop such this strong rapport over the course of the series, and then it kind of results in something that I don't think any of us are really anticipating in the final episodes, only for him to abandon her. Look, we're not talking about the later couple seasons, but obviously we know how they screw everything up, but we've got a lot to talk about still.
Yeah, I'm not sure the fans appreciate those later seasons, so we'll get to it when we get to it.
That's why I've got some plans, but again, we have to constantly hype them up. So a couple more storylines that I want to hit before the last big one, I would say. So Iron Island's quick setup scene, we obviously see Theon has made his decision. He is going to help his father win the invasion of the North. Of course, he goes up to his ship. I believe that it's called the Sea Bitch, I think is the name of the ship.
Oh yeah, I think the Iron Islands are, yeah, they're pretty right on the nose with what they think about their stuff. But the thing is, like, Theon comes and he's like, "I'm your new captain." He's like,
none of these guys respect him. They're like, "Who the fuck are you?"
Yeah, it's like, I've been, destroying and pillaging.
And raping and pillaging.
Yeah, exactly.
Years.
Like,
what is the line? I think since you were in Balon's ball sack or something like that.
Yeah, they're pretty,
rough around the edge. I just realized
sailor talk, so to speak.
I just realized they're the Bostonites of Westeros.
Yeah, I think that connection may that stereotype may hold water if you were to compare that. But not all Bostoners are that.
No,
way.
not all of them. Again, that's applying a mass stereotype to a mass group of people.
Yeah. So, but the main thing is, I would say. Theon doesn't really know how to earn the respect of
Theon's got to
the
earn a little
Iron
respect.
Islands. Well, he kind of threatens him. He's like, well, you could try to mutineer, and then I would drag you back and I would hang you. And it's like, you get the sense that the Iron Islands, they just don't hang people.
They don't hang people.
They just go ahead. It's like, you just execute the guy if he's not, following your commands. Be a man, make him pay the iron price. There's no nicety of like capturing them, putting them on trial, and then hanging them for treason.
Right.
All that stuff that lords do in lands like Winterfell, that's not going to work with these folks. It's basically, you need to be rough and tumble, take what you desire, and don't leave any prisoners.
Yeah, and this ultimately leads Theon to, once he meets first obviously you have Asha, or in this case Yara, keep getting her confused with her book name, come in and of course make fun of him a little bit more before she leaves, obviously really helping out with kind of, the dissident. He even says it's like, oh, what? So they're going to chop me up and throw me off the boat, before we even get there. Before he meets his first mate, Dagmere Cleftjaw, the second of the Harry Potter crossovers by Ralph Ineson, who appears in the last two Harry Potter movies. He was also just recently in The Green Knight, and also he's the dad in The Witch. Really good actor there. One of those deep husky voices, obviously. So he, what's it called? He tells Theon, you want to lead these guys, you got to earn their respect. And they, of course, kind of have this little discussion about it. It's like, oh, well, what's it called? What do you think they're going to do? You think they're really just going to raid a couple of sea villages? No, it's like you want to earn their respect. You got to make a big stance. And they come up with this idea. They're like, oh, we could attack Torrance Square. And then they're like, yeah, we could take Torrance Square, but we can't hold it. And that, Winterfell would come charging down. And then, of course, they kind of calculate in their heads this idea of, okay, we're going to take Winterfell. Again, not really thinking about it long term as far as being able to hold it, but just kind of taking it in the moment, Well,
I think it's Theon's master plan, right? He just sort of he knows Winterfell. He knows like they'll march out and they'll basically protect their bannermen. And so he comes up with this very complicated plot.
Right.
And, it unfolds over the next couple episodes. But we get to see sort of the seeds planted, right? So it's sort of like Theon does this and has this conversation, then cut to Bran sitting next to Rickon, who's like bashing these walnuts.
Bashing those nuts. You love that scene. It's just such a random scene.
Oh, it's come on. Rickon does nothing in this series except for complain, bash walnuts, and basically,
and then get shot.
Unfortunately, get murdered by what's his face,
Ramsay.
It's very minimal what he does in the series, but this is one of his most, and if you saw Hereditary with how they chop those nuts, this is up there in terms of top 5 walnut scenes. But for the most part, Bran is listening to a farmer, and it's like, hey, I need to, I think it's like manage my herd, but I don't really have any help. And Bran's like, hey, take these 2 orphan boys in, give them room and board, and they'll basically be your attendants on your property. And so Bran solves an issue, and in comes, Sir Roderick, and saying, "Oh man, they're taking Torrance Square." And it's like, we could ride out, we could take 200 men, and it's basically like, whoa, you need that many men?
Right.
And they're like, yeah, just do it.
Yeah, Bran doesn't hesitate here. And if anything, I think that between this sequence and the next sequence, obviously, where he's having the conversation about Osha with the dreams, or Osha's trying to like kind of pick his brain more, because obviously she's from north of the wall. She doesn't know a lot, but she knows something, right, about green seers and the magic and everything, because up north of the wall, they're a little bit more open just about magic in general. And then when Bran tells her his vision of the sea coming to Winterfell and washing everything away, including Sir Roderick, obviously, I think that of all the setup that happens in this episode, this is probably the most like interesting, both between the sequence of Theon coming up with the plan and later kind of with the setup in Winterfell and how that's executed. It truly is, to me, one of the last great Winterfell arcs before Winterfell's kind of deserted for the next couple seasons, occupied by the Boltons before the Starks retake it. And I definitely think, I don't know, like Osha's reaction to Bran in this scene is a little bit interesting because even though I don't think anybody really, obviously that's the whole brilliance of the Iron Islander invasion in this season, is the fact that because everyone's at war in the south of the Lannisters and the Baratheons and everything, no one really expects the Iron Islanders to make a move against Winterfell. But like Osha's got that face where she almost seems like she knows like it's gonna happen. So like I was just wondering, like, what do you think was going through her head in that scene?
Well, in that scene, I think there's a lot of wordplay between Bran and her. And essentially, when he asked the question, like, what do they say north of the wall, the three-eyed raven? And she just refuses to answer. And so there is sort of this, like she has an opinion, but she's not going to voice it. And even with the dream of, the ocean's going to come over Winterfell's walls and Roderick is going to die, she has a sense that sending 200 men out with one of your best commanders is probably not a good thing. But she's basically just trying to survive, and therefore she's not trying to put her neck out and say too much. And so, she doesn't have that sort of confidence to really that Bran is going to listen to her and listen to her advice. So I think there's a very subtle thing happening in this scene where, Bran's going to be Bran. He's going to do what he's got to do. And Osha is not going to rock that boat. And, I don't think it's until a couple episodes from now when Osha has to get Bran out of the Winterfell. I think that's when she starts to really take charge over Bran's safety. At this point, I think she's still very trepid about, stepping in there and giving voicing opinions, etc.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very foreboding scene, but again, a very ominous one. I think, again, for all the foreshadowing that happens in this episode, this is one of the best, I think. Obviously, because, again, the whole Theon taking over Winterfell arc, I think is one of the more underrated arcs, but I think it's actually really, really well done because the whole thing is that up until this point, Winterfell itself has been pretty out of the main fray, and then once kind of, obviously, Theon brings the war to them, it kind of shows it's like, oh, that's kind of the last, coming down of the wall as far as realizing, oh, no place in this entire bloody realm is safe, it really brings the war home. And I think Bran and Rickon's reaction is also to that is like really, really hearkening as well to that because, it's like it reminds you they're kids, because they're not like it's not like later on in the scene where they're like 22-year-olds pretending to be like 15-year-olds. It's like they're little kids and it feels like it.
Yeah, I think the storyline is really well done because it plays out in dialogue and it plays out like between the lines. Like you really have to be paying attention, looking at the visual storytelling of like the light bulb coming on, Theon's face that he knows what's going to happen if they take Torrhen Square, and then cut to, Roderick coming in and saying, hey, we got to, rally a force and protect the bannermen. The whole planting of the seeds that the farmer can take 2 orphans and you can go use them on your estate. Like all that stuff is so subtle and it's not really in your face. You really have to be paying attention to the dialogue and the scenes and how things are unfolding to really, just see the nuance that's happening in the setup of this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that being said, a couple more storylines that I want to hit just before before we get to the last big one. So we have Beyond the Wall, obviously checking back in with Jon Snow. Jon's arc after they spent the first couple episodes of Craster's, they are finally getting to their goal as well. They arrive at the Fist of the First Men, which is this massive mountain. Sam obviously gives some much needed exposition about kind of, the First Men, kind of harkening back to the people wwho the Northerners are descended from.
Well, he just tells us that he read some books.
Big surprise, Sam. Read some books.
Yeah, everybody is like, hey, yeah, you read it in a book, right? Basically at this point, they're tired of Sam.
Yeah, as everyone else is. But yeah, so they rendezvous obviously with Qhorin Halfhand, who's this legendary ranger, and he kind of, again, it's kind of a little bit of an exposition dump and a quick setup, but he basically confirms everything all the rumors that they've heard from Craster is that all the wildlings have headed north in order to join with Mance Rayder, who is, who was this, they say is this former Night's Watchman, who later obviously went and betrayed his brothers and joined the wildlings and has now become king beyond the wall. Somehow, and this is the part that's baffling all the Night's Watch members, is they have no idea how Mance has been able to rally all of the wildlings together, since the wildlings have traditionally been known, at least up until this point, as a very unruly and uncontrollable bunch. So they're a little bit stifled by it. But Corran obviously comes up with the idea that they need to start destabilizing Mance's forces now before he has a chance to really mass them and send them south in order to attack. So he obviously decides to lead a quick force in order to go to each of their camps and take them one by one. And of course, Jon volunteers to go with them.
Yeah. So Corran basically makes a great point, and I think he's very on the nose. Like, basically, Mance Rayder has united all these tribes, and therefore the wildlings are now going to be like us. They're going to be like members of the Night's Watch, or like armies south of the wall. They're going to be more organized, more structured. They're going to have more strategic plans, more logistics are going to be figured out on their end. And so therefore they're going to be a little bit more of a formative opponent. And what they need to do is they need to adopt the wildling strategy, which is more covert ops, small groups, sort of guerrilla warfare. And that's what's sort of the impetus of this sort of raid that they're going to run. And that's why Jon wants to join this, is he really thinks that because he killed the zombie in Mormount's sort of chambers, that he is sort of one of the best people to be out there basically doing this mission against the wildlings, but also in case the White Walkers sort of come, he already knows how to kill them. Which is sort of like...
It's sort of a little bit of a kind of a too big for his britches moment. I think it comes back to bite him in the ass later on. I mean, obviously...
He's selling himself big time in this scene.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
And I definitely think that, like, a little bit too big for his britches. And also, is it just me, but does it feel like, again, this is, again, minuscule problem, because, again, Jon being with the wildlings is one of my favorite arcs throughout the entirety of the show. But, like, is it just me? Did it feel like Mormont let Jon go a little bit too quickly, where Mormont kind of made Jon steward for a reason, not just in order to groom him for command, but also because he knows that at this point, yeah, Jon's a little cocky. Jon's a little headstrong. Sure, he's got a good head on his shoulders, but he still doesn't always make the right decisions. You know, he was kind of just willing to abandon his men, you know, in order to abandon the Night's Watch in order to go and help his brother. So I feel like Mormont, obviously, you know, not making Jon, like, first and foremost, and keeping a close, watchful eye on him was probably one of the best things to do for him. And now he's kind of letting him go on this mission, essentially to run loose and freeform. And we obviously see that it doesn't go well at all, because Jon unintentionally, but, you know, ends up, screwing over his brothers, and Sam just kind of volunteers to cover for him. So, like, I don't know. Like, is it just me, or did it end up...
I think Mormont's decision to let Jon join this is because he realizes that they're going to do a covert ops into the wildling camp, or they're at least going to interact with wildlings. And Jon has that sort of ability to be flexible and, you know, basically take advantage of the situation, or at least act in the moment. You know, he's very emotional, act in the moment type of person. And therefore, I think Mormont makes that sort of decision where it's like, you know, his generic personality, like Jon, might actually be well suited for this mission if things don't actually go the way that they're supposed to, because he's adaptable. You know, he's someone that, you know, is a leader. He, you know, Mormont sees that he has the potential to become a leader at some point. And I think that intelligence, that ability to sort of read the situation and make do with the pieces of the puzzle that he has, is something that Mormont is willing to trust in this scenario. And I think that's probably why he finally decides to allow him to become a ranger, even if it's for one short mission.
Yes, indeed. And unfortunately, it's the mission that, again, sets Jon up for kind of, you know, the rest of his journey. Obviously, you know, as his journey with the wildlings is probably the most formative journey that he has north of the wall before he kind of returns to the wall and oversees everything that goes on there. Now, we're cutting across the narrow sea real quick to Daenerys, your favorite storyline in Quarth. But I think the big takeaway here is the fact that Daenerys finally has something to do. Like I said, even though they are primarily set up, we're finally seeing...
shot one, right? They're teaching the dragon how to breathe fire, and feed itself. So basically, that's the start of this storyline. And if you have, you know, watched season 2 recently, you know what the end of the storyline is, which is the dragons.
Well, they breathe fire, all right.
Yeah, so basically, that's shot number 1. You know, very important to her arc right now, and then it kind of goes into this party that she's invited to, so that the 13 can sort of meet her and understand who she is and sort of welcome her to Qarth. And that's I don't know how much more story is there, because I guess there's other thing.
The big takeaway from this moment is the fact that Daenerys is, she's finally in the middle of something that she hasn't been in a long time, where she's actually not engaging with, the Dothraki obviously have their own culture that is very separate from like this quote unquote civilized nature. So she's kind of being forced to like learn how to actually like interact with people for the first time. She obviously has to like coach the Dothraki who are like trying to seize how to best steal a jewel set. And I love how Jorah's just kind of overseeing the whole thing, not really interfering with anything.
Oh, yeah. What was it? The peacock? They're just
something like that. It's just like this ornate peacock. We can gut the jewels right out of it.
Yeah, it was. I think her sort of micromanaging the Dothraki at this party was very charming. It was a really good scene. I think beforehand, like her handmaidens, for lack of a better word, are basically, fighting over this dress that Zorro sent over.
Yeah, that was a little bit confusing. It's just kind of showing up. It's like, I know why the point of the scene is there. The problem is that it's for ultimately two meaningless characters who are both not going to be alive by the end of this season. This season has definitely started the gut of like kind of all the secondary characters of season one, where Doria is obviously being tempted by the rich, lavish lifestyle that we see, that we see is is occupied by the residents of Qarth, and Arya is kind of reminding her, she's still a Khaleesi, she still has a responsibility to this Khalistar.
I think they're setting it up as sort of like, one is like you have to stay true to who you are. One is like, oh, you can easily slip into this new life. I don't know if that visual storytelling that they're doing here with this particular setup it works. I don't think it really pays off in the series. But I think I kind of understand what's going on, but it sort of doesn't really go anywhere, and so therefore it just sort of drops off. I think even after this episode, I think pretty much we don't really see them too much in the next episode or two.
Yeah, Erie's dead within the next two episodes, and Doria, obviously we see how she betrays Dany in the end and is locked in the safe with Zorro. But the big takeaway from the party, three things. First, obviously she is introduced to Piat Pri, the leader of the Warlocks, who obviously invites her to the House of the Undying. He shows off that cool little cloning trick that he does that the Warlocks love doing. The Warlocks, you want to talk about season 2, there are so many kind of just storylines of season 2 that they just abandoned ultimately. It's funny because at first I thought that like
with the Warlocks, they should have just brought David Lynch in to direct an episode and make them actually creepy.
Oh, man, that would have been something. David Lynch directing an episode of Game of Thrones. That would have been nuts.
Well, yeah, hey, but like, it's sort of like a scene out of Lost Highway where it's like they're doing a parlor trick. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but
I have. I love that movie.
Oh yeah, Bill Pullman's at a party and basically,
and then that Robert Blake, I think is the guy's name.
Yeah.
He shows up and he's like this devil character. Again, one of the most awesome, like just sound editing alone, amazing.
Yeah, he talks to him. He basically gives him his phone and he talks to him over the phone, even though he's standing right in front of him. It's a really creepy scene. It's well done. And I think the Warlocks, like this little parlor trick that they do is sort of supposed to be that. But it's very simplistic.
Yeah,
I think the Warlocks could have been made a little cooler, a little more frightening before the rest of the plot line happens.
Right, and before they ultimately just dissipate. And the thing is that they could have just been a one and done for this season, but then they bring them back for the premiere of season 3 that like kind of almost insinuated that they're going to be this continuing threat throughout the rest of the show, and then they just disappear and they never come back ultimately. Even though for the time, I don't know, like the whole Qarth storyline, as far as who is actually against her versus who isn't, is very, very confusing because in the books, Zorro is not nearly as big of an antagonist as he is made out to be in the show. Obviously, the whole thing is they make it very simplistic. Zorro is willing to give Daenerys all of these different everything that she wants, an army to take back Westeros and all these riches in exchange for being his wife, for marrying him. And Jorah, of course, advises against that, stating that if she does this, she'll completely be his property, and then she could kiss goodbye any chance of actually conquering and seeing Westeros. And Daenerys asks what other options does she have, and Jorah urges her to help him find a ship as well, but not before. And this is another thing that pisses me off, because this particular one, not of all of the elements that are introduced in Qarth, this is the one that in the books actually did have some lasting effect overall, both on just Daenerys' arc in general, as far as kind of her continuing destabilization, and then they just completely drop it at the whim of the hat, where you see Jorah start to interact with this completely masked woman named Quarth, who is assumed to be this kind of supernatural-esque spy, perhaps a faceless man. We don't know. What's it called? And in the book, she constantly pops up as Daenerys continues to make her journey towards Slaver's Bay to give Jorah and later Daenerys these cryptic warnings. Obviously, she's the one that obviously sets up that Daenerys will be betrayed by 3 different people, one for blood, one for money, and one for love. That Daenerys experiences, and that is never brought up at all. But so she's just kind of there as just like this casual, mysterious warning and being like, hey, Jorah, Daenerys is in danger in the city. Kind of just there to reinforce stuff that we already know. It's like, wow, this city, this suspicious city that they just kind of let us in for, and that where more and more secrets and more creepy things are starting to happen. No shit, she's in danger here, you know? So that,
yeah,
I'm just really pissed at how they executed that, because
it seems like they were setting it up. They were going to have it become, you know, a little bit of a storyline, and then it just didn't fit into place in later seasons. So,
yeah,
you know, I understand, like, it's one of those seeds that's placed, and then it just never gets explored. But also, like, after, you know, getting out of Qarth and moving on, you just assume that she was part of Qarth, and since Daenerys moved on, it doesn't really matter. That person is particularly just left behind.
Right.
So I think they sweep it under the rug fine, but I can see what you're saying. Like, if the character has a little more of a story in the books, whereas if you're a fan of those, you know, the writing, where that could be a little off-putting to just have something start and then just suddenly stop without really that much explanation.
Yeah, definitely. It's a little bit frustrating, especially since it, like, again, Qarth was never that supposed to be that big of a storyline, like, in this one setting. Qarth was obviously setting up for, like, a long ways down the road, because the interesting thing also about how it carries out in the books is the fact that once Daenerys has fully conquered Slaver's Bay, and then she's kind of in her season 5 arc of learning how to fully run and learning how to govern after finally seeing some success come to her hands, Quarth actually makes a comeback, obviously, in all the many pitfalls that she's doing in season 5, and Zaro even makes a comeback and attempts to appeal to her once again. And when he doesn't get her way with her, he actually helps out in the blockade and the attack, obviously, once the slavers rise up and revolt against her in Slaver's Bay. So ultimately, it just makes me more frustrated, I guess, if nothing else, for the fact that it's like, again, it wasn't never supposed to be this big thing, but it could have been, and then they clearly just were like, nope, this is only going to be this one season thing. And ultimately, I mean, we'll see, obviously, at the end when she goes through the House of the Undying and sees the visions of the future. But, like, it's ultimately more and more revealing to me that it's like, wow, this really was just, like, kind of like a pit stop and kind of a distraction as far as stuff that they kind of needed her to do rather than things that were naturalistic to the story. But the last arc that we have, which is probably, it's one of my favorites with Arya, most definitely, but I definitely get where you're coming from, where it's definitely a good example of, okay, this is what happens when you put inexperienced people in positions of this massive power, you know, where we're back at Harrenhal. Arya is now seeing herself in an interesting position, quite literally, you know, right in the lion's mouth, right next to Tywin, while he's making his big war, you know, having his big war meetings, discussing things with his general.
That was such a great scene.
One of the best scenes. One of my favorite scenes, this entire sequence, where he figures out that she's a northerner. It's the back and forth between them is just so freaking brilliant.
It's not only the back and forth between them, but it's also one of the lesser Lannisters. He's just sitting there, like, eating.
Oh, yeah.
And he's just like, oh, man, I wish I could have a respite. And then he's like, yeah, go back to your wife. And he's like, what do you mean? I would have to leave the front. And he's like, yeah, you better leave, because I'll change my mind and I'll kill you.
Yep.
And so he basically, you know, I think he's
like, you're lucky that you have the name Lannister, or else you'd be scrubbing pots in the kitchen.
So he speaks down to him, and he just says, like, this is the reason why you're alive still. Otherwise, I would have killed you. And then he runs off. And then that's where he turns and he confronts Arya about, you know, where are you from? And surprisingly, she lies and gets caught in that lie, and then goes for lie number 2.
And this one works.
Yeah.
Like, he knows that she's a northerner in some capacity. It's just a good thing that he's not able to figure out that she is Arya Stark, because he's never heard of her. Maybe he's never met her.
So I think this, like, puts her a little in danger, because it's clearly, you know, she's a liar. She's not totally honest with him. And, you know, she's right there next to him, the cupbearer, you know, doing wine or in this case water, because they're going to be there while campaigning against, or figuring out the campaign against Robb, and so, you know, she gets sent off to grab that water so that they can sort of plan out their thing. And then she just happens to run into our character of the week, right?
Yes, focus character of the week, the introduction of the official introduction of the Faceless Man into the Game of Thrones canon, even though we don't actually know that he's a Faceless Man yet. Jaqen H'ghar of Bravos, who has this very interesting discussion with Arya about how it's like, Arya at first calls him out. He's like, yeah, I saved you, and now you're a Lannister soldier. I should have let you burn. And he's like, you're in different clothes than the last time I saw you. He's like, a boy becomes a girl. I think I love about Jaqen as a character is that he's so eloquent and simplistic with kind of his mysterious veneer, but like he also has this way of kind of appealing to anyone, right? He appeals to Arya, this person who's very lost, who's experienced all this trauma, and he kind of gives her kind of this outlet that he needs. He kind of gives her an ally in a place where she has relatively few, and makes her understand it's like, okay, so, in my religion, kind of, everything has to be equal. People ultimately are supposed to die, and that is ultimately the role that we play. It kind of the Bravosi have this really interesting relationship with death that kind of separates them from the rest of the world, and that kind of contributes to the sorcery that is enacted with the Faceless Men, right, and everything.
This is where he explains, right? It's like, you saved me and the two guys I was traveling with, and so therefore, we stole those deaths from the Red God, I believe is what he says.
Right. Well, I think it's a slip up, right? He says the Red God. I think it's supposed to be like some connection to the Red Priestess, but the Faceless Men and the Red Priests of Ashai are two different religions. The Red Priests worship the Red God. The Faceless Men worship what's known as the Many-Faced God. But they obviously do a little retcon once the Faceless Men are brought back in season 5. Once Arya goes to Bravos, but. So that's a little slip up there, but it's supposed to be the many-faced God.
But anyway, he basically offers, we can replace those three with anybody that you name. So just give me a name, and I'll find them, and we'll take care of them.
Basically, and long and short of it. And Arya isn't sure what to make of that at first, because again, the whole thing is she's like, wait, who is this guy really going to kill whoever I say? And he's like, a man needs a name. And she's like, okay. And she just kind of throws one out as like a test. She's like, okay, the tickler, the guy who tortures everybody. Like,
she could throw Joffrey out there, could throw Cersei, could throw anybody.
Could throw anybody, but no.
But throws the tickler, right? It's one of those things.
I love the name, the tickler.
Yeah, but it's the tickler. It sounds like a weird barroom nickname, but
it sounds like a serial killer.
Yeah, exactly. But for the most part, I think it's like she's still young, she's still traumatized, she's still going through all this stuff, and she's not really thinking the long game at this point. It's, obviously in Harrenhal, the first person that she met that she got upset over was the tickler because of what the tickler did to some of the other folks that were captured, but also what was going to happen to Gendry. So I think if you could read into this, it's like, oh, you were about to kill Gendry, so you deserved to die. So I we don't really know. Like, I was talking with a coworker, and he sort of didn't enjoy the fact that Arya decided to pick the tickler and some random folks over the course of this plot line. And it's like, I kind of get it, because, she's just not really thinking, she's reacting. And it's like, I need instant revenge against this guy who in Harrenhal can make my life terrible. And that's the tickler, who's very sadistic and good at his torturing job.
Yeah, Arya's storyline over the course of the show is not necessarily, I'm going to admit, one of the most cohesive, but I definitely think that kind of this obsession, right, that we see with kind of just getting that instant gratification, that instant revenge on the people who have hurt her. We see that play out, and that ultimately is a fatal flaw of hers throughout the course of the show, right? Obviously, we see a brief respite from that, obviously, when she's with the Hound, right? But it's first when she kills those Frey people at the end of season 3. As revenge for the Red Wedding. Obviously, when she gets a chance to kill Meryn Trant in season 5, once she finally executes the phrase in season 7, and it even goes into the last season with kind of her unwillingness to really trust anyone outside of her family. Just kind of that need to just kind of, kill everyone that does her wrong. I think that's set up here, kind of with getting the instant gratification kill, and it kind of robs her of the ability to really see the strategy of working with people in the long term ultimately. And I don't know, do you think this is what sets her up to become Arya Stark, the low-key serial killer?
It's one of those things, like, a lot of the stuff does definitely set her up, because she's, like I said, like, when she was in the stable trying to flee and she found Needle and she killed that stable boy that was going to turn her in, seeing Ned Stark's head, even though she didn't really look at it, she knew what the scenario was. She could picture it. She was traumatized. What is it? Joran, telling her.
Oh, Yoren, yeah.
Yeah, Yoren telling the story about, the killer that killed
Willem,
his brother. Yeah, Willem. Just like all this stuff, like everything is set up to, she was traumatized and she's figuring out a lifelong coping mechanism. And I think it's, like at first when she meets the Hound, it's about killing these people and becoming a murderer. Like he kind of inadvertently teaches her to be a killer, and not to think about it, just to get it done. And then obviously she goes to Bravos and goes through the whole storyline where she's taught to be sort of a assassin for the many-faced god. And, I think it's all about just her coping with her father's death. And, it just, the things that happen lead her down a dark path.
Ultimately, yeah. And we see obviously how that resolves at the end of this episode when obviously we see the Tickler's kind of body just fall to the ground. I love the visual reference, obviously, of his head literally twisted backwards. I don't know, how is it that so many people in media are able to just twist people's heads clean around? We saw this literally earlier this year with Army of the Dead, but that makes sense, right? Because that's a zombie. They have like inhumane strength in that instance. But like, I don't know, it's just another one of those instances. Again, The Rock makes this look easy where they just snap people's heads. It takes so much effort to snap someone's neck. Like your head is so, your spine is so hardwired. It's why it's like, if you fracture even a little corner, you're basically paralyzed for the rest of your life. So like, what is it with media and everyone making this look easy?
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know about that, but like, I think we're forgetting one important.
I'm like, I had to know.
We're forgetting one important thing about this final scene of the episode.
Oh, which is where she's marveling at Gendry's abs, where she's waving around the sword. I knew you were gonna go there.
Gendry is like, he's looking like Fabio on a romance novel and cover and with a sword and everything.
Justify the sex scene at the end. They're like, see, it was set up here. It was set up the whole time.
Yeah, and she's just like eating an apple and sort of observing and being like, oh, your sword stance is wrong. And so there's a little there, whatever. There is a huge age difference. She's probably not at the age where like that matters to her.
The sad truth is that there's probably not that too much of an age difference. There's probably like a 3. There's probably like a 3 to 4, probably like maybe 5 to 6 year age difference. Maybe,
Yeah, so maybe within reason, it's reasonable. But
right.
The fact is, there is this little, just like Gendry flexing scene, which is kind of completely unnecessary, but whatever. It's very interesting choice that they chose to do this, and then all of a sudden it's just like thud. And everyone's like, "Whoa, what happened over there?" And Arya runs, and it's like, "Oh, the tickler." And then she spots, man, I didn't think that would actually work. And then she obviously spots Jaquen up in the corner. Yeah. And then does that little ominous one. I love how he does it like right by the corner of his eye. I'm not sure why. It's like, bro, we know that we can see the number 1, obviously. But really unintentionally hilarious way to end the episode, too. Yeah, I love the music, too, because it becomes his theme throughout the rest of the season. Yes. Anytime any mystical thing happens with the many-faced god, that's when sort he shifts the theme. His face. It's so funny because, like, I don't know, Pat, is it whenever the faceless men like peel off their face, they always do that like cut around, that like cool whoosh around effect with the camera where they show the faces changing in order to cover up for the CG? I don't know. Do you get face off vibes from that every time they do that? Yeah, I do. They should have basically paid Nick Cage to be one of the faces. Should have been. Oh my God, could you imagine? Speaking of which, I had to recommend a trailer for you. When we're done with this podcast, go and watch the trailer for a Nicolas Cage movie called Prisoners of the Ghostland. Trust me, you will not regret it. You will not regret it. It looks amazing. Well, I hope the rest of the audience enjoys that too. I'll definitely. I can dip into some low rent Nick Cage movies. I think he was in a Neon movie earlier this year called Pig. This is low key the Nicolas Cage comeback sans. Yeah, he's just doing as many movies as possible, and very very interesting career that he's had, from like the blockbuster season to like the Herzog movie, the Bad Lieutenant, to basically that movie. So some of these lower end movies that are actually really well done. They're just not as blockbuster as big and popular.
Hey, the last couple of movies that he's done. Hey, to put this in perspective, the last 2 movies that he did from this studio, Prisoners of the Ghostland, was Mandy, 2018's Mandy, and 2020's Color Out of Space. So.
These are like midnight cult classics, that type of thing that he's in.
Right.
But anyway, getting back to Game of Thrones.
I was about to say from our little Nick Cage detour there. Yeah, that was episode 5 of season 2.
Maybe that's what people were thinking about when the tickler was dead on the ground, because no one else looked up and saw the murderer just looking down,
right there, like just casually standing there.
Yeah, hey, I threw him down. Hey, what are you gonna do?
Again, this is where I'm like, wow, crime scenes would make none of this shit able to happen in Westeros, because freaking every time something happened, it'd be like, it was that guy, like DNA evidence and forensic editing. But it's like, no, it's the guy who was standing right next to him.
He's smiling. He's like throwing a wink at Arya. Like, no one else caught this. Although I guess half the witnesses are prisoners. So
that is true. So they're not going to say anything.
Yeah, maybe they did catch it and they were like, "Oh, that guy's on our side."
Maybe.
So
this got me in the mood to watch some Nick Cage after this.
I don't know.
Maybe some Willy's Wonderland.
So the fact is, this storyline starts. It's very mystical. We don't know what's going on. It's sort of like you have these 3 deaths, Arya. You can do whatever you want with them. This one confirms that it's true. So obviously we're looking at the countdown. Who's going to be number 2? Who's going to be the last one? That's going to keep us interested in this storyline for the next couple episodes.
Yes, indeed. And ultimately, I think it's definitely interesting as far as that goes. But again, as we've just brought to light, not necessarily the best. Season 2 definitely has some great storylines, but the secondary storylines could be a little bit better. So
yeah, I think it pays off in the end.
It does
with the many-faced guy.
Escape. Yeah,
I think those first of all, when she has the coin and she kind of takes the boat, and that's the season ender of one of the seasons. I think that gets you amped. It's like, what's going to happen when she arrives?
Right.
And then
she arrives, and then, we see what happens there.
Yeah. Listen, I think that storyline does hold water. It's pretty interesting. I think how she escapes that situation. I don't know. Like, it kind of leaves a cliffhanger. Like, you're thinking, is this, is she ever going to be the same again? Is it really her? Is it someone else? So it's, the storyline gets very creepy and, it doesn't leave you with a clean ending. You just have to sort of go with it and make your own decision. As Arya, in the later seasons, the last season in particular, just integrates back with the Starks. Yes,
indeed. Ultimately. So again, a jam-packed episode. There's a lot that happened in this episode. Again, thanks for bearing with me, Pat, as we kind of sped through everything that happened. There's minimum, there's 6 storylines that happened in this episode. It's insane.
And I think, we talked about Harrenhal and its significance a lot. And for the most part, it's pretty much after this season, right? We don't see Harrenhal.
It's after next season. After next season is the last time that we see it.
There's an episode or something like that?
Yeah, it's the whole subject of the bear and the maiden fair when Brienne's fighting the bear pit.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
so
they do bring it back, yes, but then it's never seen again until
one more time, right?
One more time, yeah, exactly. So that was our coverage of season 2, episode 5, the midway point, the Ghost of Harrenhal. I think it ranks a little bit higher than last season's midpoint, the Wolf and the Lion. Although that episode I think was probably a little bit more cohesive as far as and really starting to hit this, the kind of the crux of the storylines that we were hitting last season. So let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't worry, we'll be trying to go in live for the next couple of episodes. We'll be back next week, obviously, for episode 16, the old gods and the new. Pat, where can the good people find you?
Hey, listen, I'm helping you out on Talkin TV and Talking Thrones, right? So you can find me here or wherever you watch or listen to this show. And then I'm, on Instagram, occasionally looking things up and never posting anything. But at Patrick W. Huber, you can go to my account there, see a couple photos that I've taken. But one day I'll post again. It's one of those things. Yeah, I don't know. I just, it's not my top priority, but I really like the Instagram platform, so maybe I'll be there at some point.
Indeed. And you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews. And of course, following us on the podcast, Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. Be sure to click the subscribe button and the bell next to the subscribe button, guys. Get notified every time we put up new content. We've got the second half of season 2 to cover, which is going to be insane. And we've got so much more Game of Thrones to cover. Be sure to keep coming back for more Talkin Thrones content. This week, we've got our next first-time watch series getting going with Halloween. We're watching every single sequel in the Halloween franchise. Oh, man, this is going to be interesting, to say the least, is all I'm going to say there, especially since you want to talk about a choose-your-own-adventure kind of a storyline. Oh, man, that's getting started this week on Wednesdays. Keep tuning in for new podcast episodes on Mondays, new variety show specials on Fridays. We've got all of that and more that we're constantly giving you guys. Again, just click the subscribe button. Keep coming back for more, getting notified, all of that good stuff. You guys know where to find Pat. From myself, as always, remember, people, 12 seasons in a short film, and watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, make more pottery,